Hello, I appreciate you coming to hang out with me, Dr. Martin Sweatman. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Dan. Martin Sweatman. I work in the School of Engineering at the University of Edinburgh, and I've published a couple of papers on archaeoastronomy that are particularly relevant to Göbekli Tepe, and a couple of papers on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis too.
Yeah, I'm well aware. I'm a big fan of both subjects, archaeoastronomy in particular. I've been following since I was in my 20s to some degree. And one of the first things I just want to ask you to kind of get this out of the way, because there's a lot of skeptics that watch my channel as well. A very common misconception is that the only people that belong in archaeoastronomy are archaeologists and astronomers. But I'm sure, as you're well aware, there's a long-standing tradition of mathematicians, of number crunchers being a big part of it. Would you mind explaining why that is?
Well, I mean, I would reject the idea that you have to be within a discipline to make contributions to that discipline anyway. That's just not scientific. That's basically an ad hominem. It's the start of what you might call a religion or a church. If you have to belong to the church to make contributions, then it's a religion. That's not how we do science. Anyone can make any kind of contribution. The only thing that matters is the evidence and the arguments. Do you have the evidence to back up your arguments? And that is how peer review papers are assessed. And these arguments about, well, you're not an archaeologist, they are irrelevant, completely irrelevant.
Yeah, I completely agree with that myself. One of the things that I've seen a lot of is they talk about the well, like in your first paper on or your first archaeoastronomy paper, excuse me, on Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 43. There's a large section dedicated to probability and to basically whittling out things that are improbable. And that was where even Sir Alexander Thom, who was an engineer, who basically put archaeoastronomy, got it to be legitimized as a science. He was very much into that same grain of using math to eliminate chance as best as possible. And that's not something you invented or he invented. This is something that goes basically in archaeoastronomy. If we don't have a solid idea of what their mythology was, what stars they looked at, this is really the best that we have. Is that a good way of summing that up, would you say?
It's the same for all science. Okay, so the only difference between speculation and science is statistics. So all science, all good science anyway, will look for trying to rule out chance so that they can support the hypothesis. It all comes down to confidence. Science is based on confidence. And the way that you generate confidence or measure confidence is in terms of statistics. That's why we talk about things like confidence intervals or error bars and that kind of thing. So it's just, that's the standard rule of science, is that you try to support your arguments with some kind of statistical estimate.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, to you, you're like, what it sounds like to you is it's almost like, why do people even ask this sort of question? Of course, we apply statistical analysis to it.
Yes, that's what we do.
Okay,
that's
all
just
right.
science.
Yeah, okay, that's there.
I mean,
there we go. All right.
Science needs speculation. The science starts with speculation. That's the beginning point, and then you can make plausible arguments. But if you want to generate confidence, then you need statistics, and that's just whatever science you're doing. It's the same.
That makes perfect sense. So, would you like to talk a little about your most recent paper? That one's caused, as typical for your papers at archaeoastronomy, it's caused quite a stir, but it's pretty interesting. The one that's a world calendar paper of Göbekli Tepe. You want to elaborate on that some?
Yeah. So you mentioned the previous work published in 2017. So in that work, we came to the conclusion that Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, and I'm sure your listeners know what that is.
Yes, absolutely.
So we thought that Pillar 43 was probably a memorial to the Younger Dryas impact. Now that itself is somewhat speculative, although there is some evidence to back that up. But as part of that sort of logical reasoning process, it was based fundamentally, as you talked about earlier, on the statistical analysis of the positions of the animal symbols on the pillar and comparing them to essentially the Greek constellation set. And so what we found was that probably, according to our analysis, the animal patterns on Pillar 43 were probably, let's say, precursors to the Greek constellations, or at least some of them are. And in particular, very specifically, we thought that the sort of the bird of prey, people refer to it as the vulture. I don't know what species it is, but the bird of prey, we thought that was probably a precursor to the Sagittarius constellation. And that therefore, because of the disk that's near its wing, which we thought represented the sun, therefore it's probably representing a date using precession of the equinoxes. And we thought then, because of that date was close to the Younger Dryas impact, we thought that was a reasonable proposition for what the date represented. And as I say, there is some other evidence that can back that up. Anyway, that's the starting point. So we thought that this bird of prey was actually representing a summer solstice constellation. Now, in this new work, this new work essentially corroborates that idea, or it supports that idea. So what we found, so this was essentially I got an email out of the blue from a guy called John Gordon, who is, I think he's a psychiatrist in Montana, I believe. You can look him up, but I have his details on one of my blogs. Anyway, he emailed me, pointed out that the sort of top line so just above the bird of prey, there's a set of V symbols on the pillar. And there's one particular line that has 14 double V symbols with a single V symbol at the end. Now, alternately, these V symbols are sort of inverted, vertically inverted. Anyway, you can interpret that as a lunar cycle. So this is yet more evidence that the information on this pillar is astronomical. And as soon as he emailed me that information, I could see that, yeah, this is very likely correct. And from that, I could then go on and work out that probably it's not just the lunar cycle. And I can explain how that's the lunar cycle in a bit more detail. But there are other symbols on there that you can add up to make out 364 days in the year. So there's like a day missing. Now, there is the V from this. We think the V means a single day. It turns out there is an extra V on the neck of the bird of prey. So that could be the final day of the year, the 365th day. That's our hypothesis. And so what we think they were trying to do there, what the purpose of that is, well, two things. First of all, they're telling us that a V means a day, because they're basically using constants of nature. Okay, so the lunar cycle and the solar cycles, these are constants of nature, and anyone who knows anything about astronomy will know about these constants of nature. And so by writing out this particular row of V's as a lunar cycle, they're telling us that a V is a single day. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, by counting up to only 364, they're telling us, I think, that the V on the neck of the bird of prey means that the bird is a day. Okay, that's what the V means. So the bird is a day, not a bird. And therefore that corroborates our previous interpretation, which was that the bird of prey represented the summer solstice constellation. So presumably, this extra day is the summer solstice itself. So these two interpretations both sort of dovetail together perfectly. They're both unlikely to be wrong because of the way that the information is set out on the pillar. So together they are mutually reinforcing. So I think it's, this is yet more evidence that this initial interpretation was likely to be correct.
I was actually thinking that as you were talking, one of the things that came across my mind was with both Pillar 43 and these V's dovetailing was even the word that was in my head. That's a very good supporting evidence, because both of them are unlikely in and of themselves. So when the two of them corroborate each other and they're both unlikely, that is very, very good evidence.
Exactly. They work together. I mean, we had the statistical argument to back up the notion that these were constellations, and the summer solstice constellation being the bird of prey. And then you've got this this calendar written out in V's and other symbols, the probability that that is not actually a calendar is quite slim, I would suggest, because of the way that it's written. It's quite clear, and there is precedent as well for interpreting this row of V symbols as the top row of V symbols as a lunar cycle. So there's another example of that in the work of Alexander Marshak, going back, and that's back in the 1970s. So he was looking at sort of incised lines on Paleolithic artifacts, and there's one particular case where there is a deer antler, which has, again, the same construction of you've got 15 marks, sort of crescent marks on one side of this piece of antler and 14 marks on the other side. And again, you can interpret that as very naturally as a lunar cycle, and that's how he interpreted it. And so our interpretation is no different to that. And this piece of deer antler is much older than Pillar 43.
Oh, interesting.
So this row of V symbols on Pillar 43, as I said, there are 14 double V's alternately with alternate vertical orientation, with a single V at the end. So the way that you can interpret that as a lunar cycle is you can say, well, there are 15 vertical upright V's, so you can count 15 right to left. And then you can count back again using the same symbols, left to right. That's another 15, so that's 30. Or you can count 15, the upright V's, and then count the upturned V's back again. That's 14, makes a total of 29. So depending on how you count the V's, you've got either 30 or 29. Now, a lunar cycle it alternates typically between 29 and 30 days. If you count the number of days between each full moon, you'll get 29 or 30. So that's pretty clear. It's not proof, but it's pretty clear that that is a lunar cycle. Underneath that row of V symbols, you've got 11 small boxes. Now, if a V is a single day, then a little tiny box is not a day, it's something else. And so we interpreted that to mean repeat the above count. So this is, we think, multiplication. Essentially, this is arithmetic. So we've now got 12 lunar cycles. And if you count the days in 12 lunar cycles, 29 and 30 days alternately, you'll get 354 days. Now, underneath those small boxes are 10 more V symbols. So if you add that to the count, you've got 364, which leaves you 1 day short of the full year, which we think is the V at the neck of the bird of prey.
Now, one of the things that I've heard the skeptics say, and I'll let you put it down. I've already argued with them about this, but as typical, they don't listen. When you're talking about the 10 extra days that were underneath, why is there 10 extra days on this calendar? And how common is that sort of thing in the ancient world?
How common is it? No, this is highly uncommon. I mean, these kinds of at this time.
Yes,
I think this is the first evidence of a solar calendar.
yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to say yes, that's definitely the first evidence. If it's evidence of a calendar, it would definitely be the first. I'm more discussing the convention of using extra days. When cultures like the Egyptians, for example, they used extra days in their calendar. They didn't just have a 365.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
And would you? I'm sorry. Would you mind explaining really quickly as to why that is?
Well, okay, it's because typically if you have a calendar based on months, our modern calendar, we've designed it so that there are exactly 12 months in the year, and we ensure that that's the case. But there are plenty of examples from the ancient world where that wasn't the case. So they had, as you mentioned, the Egyptians would have had 12 months of exactly 30 days. So then you need 5 extra days to complete the solar year. Now, in this case, because we've only got essentially 29 and a half days, if you like, I'm not saying that they understood the concept of a half. They would have counted, they might have done, but they would have presumably just counted 29 or 30 alternately. But essentially, that's 29 and a half days. So 12 times 29 leaves you 11 days short of the solar year. So yeah, it's quite normal, I think. I think there's another example, Stonehenge. There is a paper by, I think it's Professor Darville, which suggests that Stonehenge can be interpreted as or it was used as a solar calendar. And again, that was similar to the Egyptian case where it was thought that there would be 12 months of 30 plus 5 extra days.
Yeah, it's basically really boils down to the convention of building your months off of the cycles of the
That's right.
moon.
Yeah,
Um,
and there's a name for the extra days. So this is a known
I,
thing.
I
They're
forget
called
what the name of it is. I'm sorry.
epigominal.
There we go. It's one of those words that construction workers never use, but we read if we're into this stuff. So yeah, I've never
Yeah,
one of the ones
I
I've mispronounced.
yeah, okay. Yeah, I didn't know about it until I looked into all this sort of calendar building stuff either.
Yeah, it's very interesting stuff, and the evidence that you put together there, the different V's and stuff. When you look at them and how the numbers line up with the extra ones off to the side, it's really it's a very interesting paper. Like when I read it, as I was telling you before we had to hang out, I was reading it a second time here a couple of weeks ago. Just it was so interesting that the number of different the math stuff does get over my head, no offense, but the other stuff is the symbolism there is so uncannily accurate. It's just it ends up where Pillar 43, there's parts of it that were extremely uncanny, and then there was some parts where you could see where a skeptic could definitely dig their wedge in. With this one, it's like, wow, man, if you know anything about astronomy, this is extremely robust. I mean, I thought your Pillar 43 paper was robust, but this is extremely robust in my opinion.
Yeah,
like a step above that.
And of course, the other thing that it's saying is that this is the data on, or the information on this pillar is astronomical. You know, and in the new paper, I go into much greater lengths than I did in the 2017 paper to justify that we should expect to see astronomical information, or that the proposal that this is astronomical information is entirely reasonable. And then when you see, and possibly expected as well, because we see later cultures with similar kinds of symbolism, similar kinds of mythology that's related to astronomy. So it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, even the archaeologists, the latest archaeological thinking is that all the symbolism at Göbekli Tepe is indicative of shamanism. But there are strong links between shamanism and astronomy. This is well documented. So again, it's reasonable to suppose that this information is mainly astronomical.
It's
and
actually
when you see that lunar cycle, it's clearly
yeah, that's the lunar cycle is that's where it seems very scientific to use it from just a basic middle school version of the scientific method. The observation is, I wonder if this is about being a calendar, and then you start going and looking at it. It's like, well, those numbers line up very well, extremely well. The notion that the ancients, it always makes me chuckle the way that archaeologists, not all of them, but some, will dismiss the idea that these things were built to emulate the sky or to be indicative of the sky at all. And it's funny to me because we know that most world religions, that shamanism, like you say, derived a lot of its stuff from the stars. It was the perfection that seemed to influence the ground. This is well known. This is well known fact in anthropology that this is animistic, shamanistic cultures tend to believe the stars drive the goings on the earth. So when you go forward a few thousand years, the biggest works in most cultures are their temples dedicated to their gods or their god kings. It only makes sense that the first big works that we see would be dedicated to whatever idea of a god that they had, and that would be the sky, quite possibly anyway.
Sure, and we see this in cultures all around in that region as well. Later cultures, I should say. The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, also Bronze Age cultures in Anatolia, so Turkey. The Greeks, obviously, it's all based on sky deities, constellations, and so on. And it makes a lot of sense that this idea, because Göbekli Tepe is implicated in, if you like, the beginning of civilization in that region, and therefore the ideas would perhaps spread out and flowed from that region into neighboring regions, along with agriculture and movements of people as well. It makes sense that, seeing that we know that we see these kinds of astronomical interests and mythology in the neighboring regions, that it makes sense that it would be there at Göbekli Tepe as well. So that's kind of like a diffusion-like argument.
Yeah, it absolutely makes sense when it's archaeoastronomy is the kind of thing that it's funny to me that the way that the skeptics hammer at it, because it's either something that crops up everywhere across the world in the human psyche, in which case you should expect to see it and it should be a commonly used lens when we interpret things, or it's indicative of a shared diffusion across the world, one way or the other. And they don't want to admit either one of those things, it seems. But the idea that
go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, this is the thing. It doesn't have to be astronomical. We can't prove it's astronomical. But as you just said, the astronomical lens should be one of the first things that you consider.
Yeah,
and it's right there on the pillar, staring back at you. So when John Gordon first contacted me about this, I was really interested in what he had to say. I was delighted to hear from him, because it was clear that this was essentially confirming or strongly supporting our previous idea.
Yeah, it definitely does. Definitely is a strong word, but I'm not a scientist, so I can get away with that. But it's certainly from the outside seems to it dovetails extremely well. And again the fact that both of them are so unlikely to occur by chance on their own.
Yeah.
When you talk about the diffusion side of it, or the psyche side of it, one of the things that I'm fond of saying when you talk about the way that the human mind is with religion, I mean, the Egyptian pharaoh and the little old lady at church on Sunday are both trying to get up into the heavens when they pass. I mean, this isn't, this has been the same kind of thinking for a very, very, very long time. And it's not, there's spiders that use the stars to navigate. The idea that humans weren't all over this stuff at a very ancient time is to me, it's one of the most dismissive and absurd things that we see come out of people that shouldn't be commenting on this stuff, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Ancient people would have been absolutely fascinated by the stars. There's no conceivable way that they wouldn't have been, because it's half of their day, and what else do they have to do? They're going to be looking up at the sky. They're going to be making up stories, weaving them into sort of complex mythologies. They're going to be making constellations. It's absolutely clear that would happen. And yeah, the other thing I would say about this V on the bird of prey on pillar 43. So previously, I guess, if you just sort of look at that, you might think, well, that's just decoration. Maybe it's indicating some plumage or something around the neck. So there is evidence again that symbols at the neck at Göbekli Tepe seem to be important. So in the paper, I give an example for pillar 18. So pillar 18 has symbols of the sun, or what looks like the sun and the moon, so a disc and a crescent. Again, indicating that probably these are astronomical and probably these are important because they're at the neck of the T pillar, pillar 18. But that's not the only case. There are several other cases that I document in the paper. So another good one is the Urfa man, which was found in Şanlıurfa, and is thought to be contemporaneous with Göbekli Tepe. If you look on the Urfa man, he's got a double V. People referred to it previously as, he's wearing like a V-neck jumper, which is a bit silly. It's clearly, I think, indicating, now that we can interpret a V as a single day, it's interpreting that this Urfa man represents some kind of, probably a deity to do with time. I would suspect that's what I say in the paper. Maybe a time-controlling deity, perhaps a creator deity. Time-controlling deity, again, there are examples that we know of from more well-known mythologies like the Greek mythology. Kronos, this kind of thing, yeah. So, it could be a precedent to that kind of mythological figure.
Yeah, even to just to play devil's advocate a little bit, it could even be if you look at it through a very contemporary lens, very modern lens, you could even see it as like a Christ figure that might have been resurrected in 2 days instead of three or something like that. It could have a number of interpretations, but knowing that that has to do with days does make it very tantalizing. That it offers another. That's one of the things I love about the archaeoastronomy lens is that if when employed, it frequently offers like a whole lot more of a rabbit hole to dive down with the iconography that you get from an area or a culture. And a lot of
Yeah,
times, like with Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example. We know so little about what that iconography means that any lens that potentially offers us any insight, in my opinion, should at least be ran with until it's exhausted.
yeah. I mean, so this is quite a good example to show up the difference between speculation and then um, sort of statistical based arguments, which give you more confidence, which are more scientific. So the idea that the Earth Man represents like a time controlling deity, that's speculation based on what we see. So it's a reasonable proposition, but it is speculation. That's not backed up by any statistical analysis. And that's quite different. So when people sort of criticize this work, I think it's important to draw a distinction between parts of the interpretation that we can be very confident about because of the amount of evidence or the statistics, and those parts which are more speculative. And so I think it's important to draw those distinctions.
No, that's a very good point.
So
Yeah.
you mentioned there it could be that this represents 2 days, that it's something to do with uh, uh, this figure may be resurrected in 2 days or something. Yeah, perfectly reasonable proposition. The other thing I would add to that is that he's got animals on either side, and we have interpreted the animals in this interpretation. We think that they're constellations, and so you've got the master of animals figure typically is holding a pair of animals, and this figure at Sheberk also has. I'm kind of getting mixed up there. So I've gone now from Erferman to a very similar carving at the Sheberk. There's a relatively new excavation at Sheberk, and again, the Sheberk carving, we see a very similar figure to the Erferman. So he's got V's at the neck. He has the same kind of pose. He's probably the same deity or the same person, and he's got animal symbols like the Master of Animals symbol that we're quite familiar with in that part of the world. And so now you're thinking, well, and if these are constellations, then how do we interpret that? So he's got some kind of time symbol at the neck, the V. He's got some kind of processional time symbols, perhaps the constellations. So I putting those two together, I was thinking that was an additional reason for thinking that he might be some kind of time-related deity.
No, that's again. I was just kind of playing devil's advocate. I kind of trying to put a spotlight on because it is, as you say, this is often the speculative part of the hypothesis, but it's one of the things, like I say, that I like about archaeoastronomy so much is it gives you such a wide rabbit hole to run down where there's that the idea of them looking at the stars and building things that they equated with the stars is not, or that are related to the stars, isn't ludicrous or absurd. So when you start looking at things that connect to it, you could build all kinds of. If you start seeing those V symbols on some of the skulls that they know were associated with whatever skull cult they like to claim it was a thing at Göbekli Tepe, for example, it could offer insight into that depending on how these things are looked at. It's what's saddest to me is that this stuff gets ignored and kind of relegated to a small corner of the scientific community by kind of this stamp of woo that's put on it, and it's like this is what I've got a book up here by E.C. Krupp who's gone out of his way to debunk things like the Orion Giza hypothesis, but there's nothing that you're saying here that fundamentally he would be like, no, that's bullshit. Not one thing that you're saying that he would knee jerk to until you say, well, this was on Ancient Apocalypse. Hang on now, hang on. And that's a very sad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it may be depends what you're familiar with. If you're familiar with the archaeoastronomy literature, then what I'm proposing is slap bang consistent with all of that, and actually I think quite well evidenced relative to some papers, for instance. So I think people that aren't so familiar with the field might, and especially if they're sort of skeptical of anything to do with astronomy in ancient times, then yeah, they're going to be skeptical of this whole thing. But really, that's just their ignorance.
Yes, it's one of the fundamental things that when I read archaeoastronomy papers, they talk about the very basics of it. Giulio Magli, I'm sure you're aware who he is. He talks about how you look for a bridgehead. You find a place that you can say, we can equate this with something from a known culture. And if assuming that is what you have here, let's run with that and see what we can get. And that's exactly what you did with Pillar 43 with Sagittarius and Scorpio. That's, I mean, Scorpion in particular, that is, there's no arguing that could very well be a representation of Scorpio, and that there is no origin for that constellation, like Taurus, like Leo. There's a couple of them, a handful, that go so far back into prehistory we have no idea when. They potentially show up on cave paintings and stuff, right? So it's very feasible that is your bridgehead that you start to build your paper from, and that's standard operating procedure for archaeoastronomy. But it's looked on, like you say, by many, it's very skeptically.
Yeah, it's also just how science works. You have something which tells you, oh, hang on, there's something here, there's a pattern here, perhaps. So there's, in scientific works, there's always some kind of, as you say, bridgehead. There's always some kind of initial clue, and then you build the case, and you make sure as best you can that the evidence that you bring, you build the more confidence in that case. Preferably by using statistical methods.
Yeah, and that's one of the funny things. They blast at archaeoastronomy quite frequently when it comes from people like yourself. But if you turn around and look, they'll a lot of times find the exact same kind of work done by people that are working at Harvard or at Cambridge University in the astronomy department. And it's almost identical, except for in the way that they use numbers, which is something that it is kind of unique to this field, or it seems not. There's a lot of different versions of statistical analysis that seem to be brought to bear in archaeoastronomy, generally speaking, based on the expertise of the mathematician that comes in and does that analysis, which is where your stuff has been very unique in that regards. Again, the math gets above my pay grade, but it does. I can scratch the surface, and it's a lot, not a lot different, but a little bit different, where you can smell the chemical origins there, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the analysis that is in my papers on this is really. It's pretty straightforward. So there's nothing too complicated, and that, which is good. I like to try and keep things simple.
No, it's good stuff. It's drawn a lot of ire, of course, but the Pillar 43 one in particular, like the idea that Scorpio was an invention of the Greeks or the Babylonians or the Egyptians or whatever. That is really, that's very speculative. And to be honest, it's almost silly when you think that would kind of imply that the zodiac just popped up, almost entirely complete out of nowhere in the early days of history.
Yeah. So the sort of I guess the standard conventional story is that so there's a couple of papers by Rogers back in I forget which decade they were, but which essentially make the case that these constellations, the zodiacal constellations anyway, probably began somewhere in Mesopotamia, probably in maybe the 3rd or 4th millennium BC. And then things developed over time, and then they developed an entire zodiac and more constellations, and then somehow this made its way to Greece. And the reason for thinking that is that there isn't really any mention of the zodiacal constellations in Greece, at least it's thought there wasn't, before about sort of 400 or 500 BC. So that's the sort of standard story. It's from out of Mesopotamia, but that's just pure conjecture. It's a story, and there's absolutely no reason why the Greeks couldn't have had the entire constellation set already. It makes a lot of sense, actually, that if you propose that, say, that this was known in Turkey, because of both Mesopotamia and Greece are bordering Turkey, and there would have been a lot of exchange of ideas and people. I mean, where we're talking, Göbekli Tepe is Mesopotamia. It's just the top end rather than the southern end. So yeah, there would have been a lot of exchange of ideas and people. It makes sense that there could have been this place where the ideas have flowed out to neighboring regions. And there is actually an account of a myth by, so I think it's written down by a guy called they call him Pseudo Eratosthenes. I think that's correct. Anyway, he's recording a myth by Hesiod, apparently, but we've lost the work by Hesiod, so we don't know that it exists other than it's referenced in this Pseudo Eratosthenes from about 200 BC. And in that myth, he refers to, well, in this myth attributed to Hesiod, they refer to Scorpion, or the Scorpion and Orion, or Scorpius and Orion. So clearly, at least one of the zodiacal constellations, well, I say clearly, possibly at least one of the zodiacal constellations was already known by about 700 or 800 BC in Greece. So the standard story that, oh, it all came from Mesopotamia looks a bit shaky.
Yep.
But that story is contemporary anyway. So, you know, there are other more modern papers that admit to this. We don't really know where these constellations came from. It's an unsolved problem.
Yeah, it's honestly, I've speculated, and this is speculation. I mean, I've done some research and I haven't seen anything that flies in the face of it. The convention of the 12 hours, the 12-hour day, or 12 hours in the circle, so 24-hour day, 12 months in a year. That a lot of that can be derived from the moon, but a lot of that also you get your 360-degree. This convention seems to show up in a lot of different places, and it seems to be attached to the zodiac in those regards. And if you go back way back in time, where they were following herds, and there was, the stars were maybe not even named, when it's the sun rises in a different constellation at 4 different key points in the year, it only stands to reason that it wouldn't take long before there would be some story that would get equated with those stars. And we know that people equated them with animals. As soon as they noticed that these different star patterns, that would be the way they would most likely pass it down to their apprentice or their kids or whatever. So to me, it seems really, it seems like this is something that was probably just like part of the human tradition, like the Great Hunt and the constellation Orion, where it just goes so far back that you know that shamans that had no idea what writing is were talking about this stuff.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Great Hunt. That's one example. The Pleiades
Yes.
is another, and Orion. So these constellations, it's there are papers that have looked at all of this in great detail, and they conclude that those constellations, at least in their view, from their analysis, would have had an origin which is probably 50,000 years ago or more.
I would be surprised if it was less. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's because of the similarity in many of these myths and stories across the whole world. And so it makes sense, through their analysis anyway, it makes sense that the origin would have had to have been very, very ancient. But then if that's true for some of those constellations, which are associated again with animal symbols, then it makes sense that many of them could have a much more ancient origin.
Yep, that's very true. You can see them evolve throughout cultures. You can see some of them change when they get passed from the Mesopotamians to the Greeks. You can see, or from the even into the Babylonian days. Like there was the Babylonians, instead of the virgin, they had like the farmhand or something like that. There was a couple of different ones, the hired man or something like that. There's just a couple of different minor cultural things, but it gets mocked a lot, because it doesn't look like a scorpion. But honestly, if you look at all the constellations of the zodiac, that is the most uncanny by a country mile. All the rest of them look like boxes and playing connect the dots. But that one, it's like if you were to pick an animal, okay, yeah, scorpion, okay, that's it. It's kind of, it's funny. You can almost tell the people that haven't actually gone out and looked at the stars when you have these conversations, because some of these things, like Orion's belt, that just hits you in the damn face. You go stare at the sky and it just punches you right in the nose. There's no way you're not noticing that.
Orion is really, really obvious.
Yes.
And of course, another factor is the sky these days. People don't tend to notice it so much because of all the light pollution. But back in the day, it would have been so obvious, and the Milky Way too.
Yeah, well, I took my son out the first time to go stargazing when he was about 12, and had to drive about an hour out of town and up into a valley where, up into the mountains and then down into a valley where there's almost no light pollution at all. And that's the first thing he asked. He's like, "Dad, what's that big stripe in the sky?" Buddy, that's the Milky Way.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, the other great thing is that if we're correct, and I'm fairly sure we are, that the V symbol, the V represents a single day, then there are other things that we can interpret with some confidence, not in Göbekli Tepe, and if they are found in the neighboring Tashtapela sites, then that would be a good place to start. Well, the V means a single day. So at Göbekli Tepe, in the same enclosure D, as pillar 43, there's pillar 33. Pillar 33 shows on one side you have some tall birds. Now, we previously interpreted these tall birds to be Pisces from pillar 43. Mm-hmm. On the other face of the pillar, you've got the fox. And from out of these animals are leaping snakes in bunches. And now, so if the animals are constellations, then how should we interpret these snakes leaping out in bunches from their bodies and their torsos of the bird and the fox? So the most immediate thing that comes to my mind is that these are meteors. It looks like it just looks like a really nice picture of a meteor stream. So that's another reason why, given the date that we've interpreted from pillar 43. And then you've got pillar 33, which looks like a meteor stream. And of course, on pillar 43, there is the little headless guy at the bottom of the pillar, which presumably means something to do with death. Put that together, and you come up with a reasonable proposition, I think, that this is all related to the Younger Dryas impact. Yeah. But then on pillar 33 as well, where these snakes, the snake heads converge on this, the inner face, the sort of narrow face of the pillar, we've got another set of V symbols. So you've got vertically oriented V symbols now. So from one side of the pillar where the birds are coming, I think there are 14 V symbols in a vertical row, and the snakes from the fox that converge on this inner side, and there you've got 14 V symbols. And so, if the V means a single day, then perhaps what that means is that the meteor stream emanated from Pisces and whatever the fox is. We think the fox, because it looks similar to part of Aquarius, that means it was perhaps a precursor to Aquarius. So possibly then it's showing a meteor stream that emanated for 13 days from one constellation and then 14 days from the other constellation. So, almost a month in the year. And the meteor stream that we now know that emanates, or at that time would have emanated from that direction, and is a large meteor stream, so it has a long duration, is the Taurids. And of course, the Taurids are also implicated in the Younger Dryas impact. So everything kind of adds up that way. There's another stone plaquette found at Göbekli Tepe, which has 6 V's in a vertical row. And then there is like an arrow, like a wavy sort of a wiggly sort of arrow symbol And so again, you can interpret that, well, if this sort of wiggly line is like a snake or a meteor and you've got 6 days, perhaps that's recording another meteor stream which lasted 6 days, possibly.
Yeah.
Given the interpretations that we already have, that would make sense.
Yeah, the meteor interpretation, that's where the rubber hits the road as far as the controversy goes. To me, it's you know, if I'm a sci-fi nerd and a gamer nerd, if I was reading an old Warhammer 40,000 book and I saw artwork of animals with snakes crawling out of them, I would be like, this is the orcs talking about meteors. This is not it's very, very straightforward. That's the first thing I thought of when I actually saw that pillar, was like, this is so reminiscent of that's uncanny. But
it's a nice picture. I mean, it's actually a good piece of artwork, I think. It's such a nice representation of a meteor stream. That's how a meteor stream would look. It would sort of emanate in bunches from the bodies of these constellations.
Honestly, it's
really nice.
There's some of that stuff that looks almost like you have to do a double take, and it's like, is this real? Did somebody Photoshop this? Is this freaking AI artwork? This is just so uncanny, man. It's so uncanny. And that one is of all of them, the most it's very, like you say, very much looks like that. There's a number of things in that area that is so amazingly tantalizing. Like I said it to you, and I knew that somebody else had already said it to you at that point, but I couldn't not tell you, just on the off chance, with the one where it's just it looks so much like the constellation of Taurus and Orion that it's to think that it wouldn't be that. Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's to think that that's not what it is. It's almost, if you know anything about astronomy, you almost are hard pressed to not see that there. It's just
that's the sort of classic pose for Orion, is with one arm sort of held aloft. And in fact, there's another really nice part of the puzzle, another piece of evidence. If you so there was this it's called graffiti, but this rock carving found in the Egyptian desert. I forget the archaeologist's names who found it. Is it Darnell? I can't remember. Anyway, there's this rock graffiti, and there are so many correspondences or correlations, if you like, with Pillar 43 in this graffiti, that you think, well, the person who carved that graffiti and the person who carved that pillar, surely they knew the same system of notation of whatever it is. We think it's astronomy. And on that, in that graffiti, you also have, not only do you have another semicircle symbol like you do on Pillar 43, not only do you have, like on Pillar 43, there's a symbol that we interpret to be similar to Ophiuchus, which is a snake in sort of caught in the beak or something like that of this bird. So there's a symbol just like that on this rock graffiti. But also on that pillar, there is this symbol, this belted figure with his hand raised high with a club in it, which is the classic pose for Orion. Now, of course, the archaeologists, I think it was Darnell, could be wrong, interpret that as evidence for a mythical scorpion king. So this is like this proposed figure in Egyptian prehistory. And the reason they interpret this figure as the Scorpion King is because there is, on that rock carving, there is a bird of prey, I think it's a hawk, which they interpret as Horus, above a scorpion. On Pillar 43, we have a bird of prey above a scorpion. There are so many correspondences. There are tall birds on this rock graffiti as well. So there are so many correspondences. I'm reasonably certain that whoever carved these two things, they knew the same system, and it has a very obvious astronomical interpretation.
Yeah, that's the part that a lot of times they try to make these things so mutually exclusive. For example, with Göbekli Tepe, one of the talking points that they was used a lot against your 2017 paper was the skull cult. There's a skull cult. All this stuff is symbolic of the skull cult. That's not a sun. That's a skull. But that is, if you play devil's advocate and say, fine, they had a skull cult there, and this is all part of the skull cult. does that preclude that astronomical symbolism would still be used in that? Absolutely not. We see that all over the world where they still incorporated what they saw in the sky into whatever cult that they had. So it's so funny to me that they always try to separate all these things and parse them out. And it's like the to the ancients, I think it's one of the things that us modern people forget a lot. To the ancients, the sky wasn't magical. The world wasn't magical. Magic wasn't magical. It was just, this was the way the world was. The sky seemed magical and it was part of reality, and it wasn't magic. It was, and you honored it and you did what you're supposed to do as far as what your ancestors taught here, right? It was a lot different as far as the thinking about these things go, I believe, than what we have nowadays.
Two things about the skull cult idea. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't a skull cult at Göbekli Tepe, so
Yeah,
there's evidence of fragments of skulls with lines incised in them. So yeah, there could well have been. So the issue is whether what's on Pillar 43 has anything to do with a potential skull cult. Now, the thing that they're calling the skull, this is a plain circular disc. If you go and see Pillar 43 yourself, it's a plain circular disc. It is not a head or a skull. And on Pillar 18, we have a plain circular disc, albeit with a little dimple in it next to a crescent symbol. So that's the sun and the moon, presumably. So why you would then think that this other disc is a skull, I think that's far-fetched. Now, the other thing about that is the idea of I've said that the skull cult could be true, but it's whether it's on the pillar. So then if you're going to be comparing these two hypotheses on a level playing field, the skull cult interpretation doesn't explain anything else about the pillar. I mean, apart from everything that you interpret from that pillar, you have to put in by hand for the skull cult idea. You get nothing out of it. And that therefore means it's very speculative. That's the whole point. That's the speculation. And it's statistics which help you arrive at a more sort of confident position. Now, the astronomical interpretation has so many things that then line up, and so you start with the basic interpretation, and then you get all of this extra stuff for free. And that's the great thing about this interpretation. That's a good thing. That's why we should, if we're on a level playing field, we should prefer this astronomical interpretation, because it explains so many of the details that the skull cult idea doesn't. It doesn't explain anything that you haven't already put in by hand. So what I'm saying is the skull cult idea is very speculative, whereas the astronomical interpretation is much more robust.
That's a good way of putting that. It makes a lot of sense. One thing I've noticed was we do see depictions of decapitated heads in that immediate region in that time, and they tend to have faces. They tend to have a human, a little bridge brow, a lot like the relief carvings that we see of humans at Göbekli Tepe, or in that area. Another one is on if the interpretation, again, to kind of devil's advocate it, if that is supposed to be the head of the decapitated man that's below the vulture, if that's what you've heard them say that sometimes, that doesn't mean that it's not still the sun. It could be all incorporated together as symbolic. I mean, we see this kind of artwork all the time with or just in, not even just artwork, where the sky and the ground are mingled together, and the idea of them mingling the art together would completely make sense. Here's the dead man's head is the sun. That's not something that would be absurd or crazy. It would be an artistic flourish, right? Like using a snake to draw the letter S at the beginning of a book.
So maybe that's the one thing actually out of that skull cult interpretation that you get, is that you have the skull, potentially the headless man, and you have the bird of prey, and decapitated heads are seen with birds of prey in other places. So you've got one thing that it explains for free, essentially, is that there's this headless man at the bottom of the pillar. But apart from that, it explains nothing else about what are all the other animals doing there, why are they in those specific positions, what are the semicircles at the top of the pillar. For every single one of these things, you have to put the hypothesis in by hand. You have to add your own interpretation. You have to add information yourself to make sense of it. Whereas the astronomical viewpoint, you get it for free.
Yeah, it offers no new insight. That's the best. Like I was getting at, basically, my point there was it's a poor tool for debunking, because when they bring in things that aren't mutually exclusive, it doesn't really matter. It does. Okay, fine. That may well represent a human head. It still may well represent a sun at the same time. Your debunking is their debunking there is a moot point. Uh, it relies on the kind of cynicism that's not, it really doesn't have a place there. One of the
another idea that was proposed, I think probably before the skull cult idea, because I didn't have the evidence of the skulls at that time, was so maybe this goes back to Klaus Schmidt's time, was that this was the symbolism and Göbekli Tepe was a lot to do with ancestor worship. Fine, ancestor worship or a death cult, perfectly reasonable interpretations, and they line up with, this is perhaps a memorial to the Younger Dryas impact. So, these ideas, like as you were saying, the point I'm emphasizing is that these ideas aren't always exclusive.
No, it's yeah, those ancient cultures are complicated, and if you look at even old art, you can see in ancient art where they will mingle two things together. They'll have a horse growing out of the ground or some such stuff. It's not uncommon to, like the generic example I used of using a letter, using a snake for the letter S. These things have been going on for as long as artists have been adding a flourish. So it's not unreasonable to think that they would tie these things together, especially if they're putting it together. And like you say, they already have this symbolism of a human head with the bird of prey. Then they're putting this decapitated body right there by it and a sun. It's like, well, heck, let's just position this where it does kind of ring both of those bells at the same time. That would, from an artist perspective, you would almost have to do that, wouldn't you? I mean, it's uncanny and staring you in the face if this is a common symbol in your culture. So I find those kinds of debunkings to me are like they kind of betrays the bad faith. It's one of the things that I say a lot, that I use psychology to just kind of gauge the arguments that I'm looking at when the science is outside of my wheelhouse. And that's one of the things that lets me know right away the person I'm dealing with isn't exactly they're not very knowledgeable in the stuff, where they just dismiss the things that are knee-jerk reaction to dismiss things like that.
I mean, as a scientist, we're always looking for explaining power. A good theory, you can compare theories by their explaining power. If one theory can explain more data better, and if it can do it with fewer assumptions, then it's clearly the better idea.
Well, yeah,
that's all related to Occam's razor as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, when as I said before, the astronomical interpretation, it explains so much.
It does. I agree. So where are you going at with it from here? I mean, I think at this point we've established pretty well what your basic hypothesis on both these papers is. Where I'm sure you're not just sitting there playing Xbox. Where are we at from here?
Well, recently, the last year, really since the I've been pretty busy. So on the one hand, I'm trying to get this paper on the lunar solar calendar published, but at the same time, dealing with the sort of reaction to the or rebuttal to the comprehensive refutation of the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. That's taken quite a while. So there are two papers. One is already out. One will be out within a week, probably less than a week. So they in different ways, they sort of push back against this comprehensive refutation. So there's that.
Mark Young keeps reminding me that I need to cover those.
Yeah, I mean, there's.
I plan on it, but knowing your next one comes out in about a week, that'll be perfect. I'll hit them both at the same time.
There's a lot of stuff that you could go to town with in that comprehensive refutation. So the paper that's going to come out soon, I say it's probably a matter of days, is a summary of the problems with every section of the comprehensive refutation. And then the paper that's already been out for a couple of weeks does a much more detailed rebuttal, line by line rebuttal of some sections, just a few sections, because obviously you can't do line by line rebuttal of their paper, which is already nearly 100,000 words. So we had to select a few, some of the most important sections and do a detailed rebuttal on those. So that was that. But in terms of Göbekli Tepe, I do have another paper submitted at the moment, which I'm going to not say too much about, but that's with another journal. But then there's this whole idea of, and recently I gave a presentation at a conference as well. So I was invited to give this presentation at a conference about more or less what we've been talking about today. But then in the sort of longer term, what's next? So we have all of this. We think we have this interpretation of Göbekli Tepe, probably correct, and we see similar notation, similar symbolism much later in the Bronze Age, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and then through to Greece. So you think, well, there has to be. It's unlike this is too much of a coincidence. These are almost certainly connected. So there has to be some kind of breadcrumb trail through the Neolithic and into the Bronze Age that connects the symbolism in that region. And I try to outline some aspects of that in the new paper. So I mentioned the Master of Animals symbol, and I mentioned the semicircle symbol. So it appears that with this information, we can now maybe go through lots of archaeological reports in the Mesopotamian region, in the Egyptian region, in that period, the Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, and have a look at them again to see if actually these can be interpreted. Breadcrumbs that connect Göbekli Tepe to these later.
See if they got breadcrumbs in these papers that we've already looked at. That's interesting. I like that
because we have some good information now. The semicircle probably means the setting sun, and is indicating that these animal symbols are probably constellations. They're not animals. And then you have the Master of Animals. So if we see these symbols with animals throughout that period, then we can potentially reinterpret a lot more stuff. But that's a lot of work. There are a lot of archaeological sites that fill that period. So I haven't really got started on that. If someone else wants to take over and do that, that's fine.
Gladly pass that torch, huh?
But it should be there, because we see Pillar 43 and the stuff that we see pre-dynastic Egypt and the early Bronze Age is so similar. There really should be a connection. So that symbolism must be there, I think, throughout that period.
Yeah, that's definitely worth looking at. It's because it's been tantalizing so far. I mean, things like it again to somebody who's into astronomy, like the scorpion being on the Pillar 43. That right off the bat, that is extremely tantalizing, especially when you see over. I think you said there was Chow book that had the Orion Taurus symbolism. It's like there's the symbols that we have to extrapolate and like to find Gemini and the vulture. That does look, that's a very uncanny, the way that its arms are spread like the archer's arms are spread. But that's, to a skeptic, that gives them plenty of wiggle room. But when the thing looks like Orion fighting a bull, when the thing looks like the scorpion in the sky, there ain't a whole lot of wiggle room anymore, buddy. It's just, at that point, it's the rejection of these hypotheses. To me, the rejection out of hand. To me, like when Stefan Milo said, for example, that this was the most in a series. We're talking about it from Ancient Apocalypse in a series that he thought everything was ridiculous. This was the most ridiculous part. And to me, it's like you've never even used a telescope. You couldn't fix a star if your life depended on it, could you? That's to me, that's what that says.
That's just an ignorant thing to say, I think.
I completely agree. It's there's the Flint Dibble said that he thought that in the debate with Hancock, he thought that the undulating serpent on the Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, the undulating serpent that comes down with the shadow play with the equinox.
Yes. Yeah.
He thinks that that's a coincidence. And at that point, it's like, well, you don't even need to be weighing in on these topics at all, sir, because this is clearly not a coincidence. But that's with archaeoastronomy, with astronomy in general, especially when you're dealing with ancient historians and astronomy. These are almost oil and water when it comes to disciplines. One's up, one's down. One is very hard and fixed, and the other one is extremely speculative. And and kind of up in the air. You can say, we know for a fact this bone came from that far back, but what does this carving mean? Well, here we are talking about it 12,000 years later, and there's plenty of room for discussion.
Yeah, there does seem to be quite a lot of resistance to archaeoastronomy or astronomical interpretations in some sectors of the archaeological community. But I don't know how, I mean, I'm a bit isolated. I don't really know how prevalent that is, whether it's just a few people, whether it's a minority of people who are kind of in denial. I think more broadly that these ideas are actually reasonably well accepted.
They are
reasonably well entertained, let's say.
In the academic community, by and large, from what I see, they are. When there's I've referenced it in numerous videos of mine. There's a field guide for archaeoastronomy for archaeologists. I think it's a North American one and a British one, if I remember right. And there's so it's not, and they're telling them how to register alignments and how to look for symbols and stuff. But they basically tell them to record general data and then kick the ball to an astronomer. But it isn't something that's rejected out of hand. It's as I'm sure you're well aware, it's the association with Graham Hancock and Atlantis and all of that that's caused the hoopla. If you would have come up with it, and the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, if you would have come up with this hypothesis and it had nothing to do with, there was no Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, like, oh, they just might have said a comet, this would be an interesting thing, and there wouldn't be half the pushback. But you add a few people's names or the YDIH, and all of a sudden it's a flashpoint.
I completely agree. Yeah, it's like a double or triple whammy. So not only are you trying to, it's research, it's something new, but it's controversial in itself because of how it overturns previous assumptions. But then you add in this extra dimension. The association with essentially Graham Hancock, I think. I think the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, again, if that was by itself, I think that would be fine. I think a lot of it is just because of the association with Graham Hancock, and therefore, because it's associated with Graham Hancock, it has to be wrong, which is ridiculous. I personally think Graham Hancock should get a lot of credit. For various things. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on his writings, but from what I gather, he's proposed an ancient, in his earlier writings, he proposed an ancient cataclysm or apocalypse. He seems to have got that dead right. He proposed an advanced ancient civilization. Well, how do you interpret advanced? I don't know. But in his more recent presentations, I'm not sure whether he's brought it back a bit or whether he's just been misinterpreted. But now his what he's saying about an advanced civilization is not technologically advanced, but just that they had good knowledge of astronomy, perhaps good knowledge of, or they're able to, they were seafaring and so on. And that seems to be borne out as well. So he's got at least two things, almost certainly two things right. The only thing that's sort of more, I would say, question or is much more speculative is the idea that civilization was reseeded by the survivors of the cataclysm. And I think that's very hard to come up either side of that argument with good evidence either for or against. So I think, that's just, if that's what he thinks. I mean, I personally don't think that, but I don't have a lot of evidence against that position.
Sure. I think a lot of what Graham Hancock has done that he doesn't get credit for in those regards, for one, there's sites like Göbekli Tepe, like Gunung Padang, like Nan Madol, that were almost unheard of before Graham Hancock came around and shone a flashlight on them. And that in and of itself, there's a lot of people that become skeptical of Hancock's work 10 years later, but they go into archaeology or anthropology or something along these lines because of what they saw on Ancient Apocalypse or what they read in a book or something like that. There's plenty of people. And Mark Young, when I interviewed him, that's one of the things he said, that he went into school because he read Hancock stuff and was really interested by it. And this isn't new. You go back, Mark Leonard, the famous Egyptologist. When he started off, he was an Atlantis hunter, and the Edgar Cayce Foundation was putting him through college. This has been part of it. Even the excellent anthropologist John Hoops, who I absolutely love and have nothing bad to say about at all. Even he got started because he thought lost civilizations in Atlantis and ancient aliens was cool. This is the way it's. Carl Sagan was really he understood how to be a science publicizer and to use that interest to draw people in instead of push them away. He didn't say, you're stupid for believing in little green men. He said, let's sit down and talk about it, even though inside he's like, I think that you're a little off there, buddy. But he didn't care. He had the discussion. And we have a few archaeologists like that. Bernhardt is one. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm so bad with names, but
yeah. As a scientist, you always have to be aware of what you don't know as well as what you think you know. So this question of what was there a civilization that preceded the Younger Dryas and then reseeded civilization afterwards? Who can say? Who can say there wasn't? I mean, I don't think there was, but who can say there wasn't?
Yeah.
What evidence would you bring to that?
Yeah.
Because I don't think that Graham anymore is or even maybe he wasn't originally. He wasn't thinking of like an Iron Age civilization or a technologically advanced civilization. I think what he's talking about now, and maybe he was before, is a Stone Age civilization. So how would you distinguish that from the other Stone Age cultures that were around?
Yeah, the only thing that the only things of his that, like, when he speculates on the big rocks and how they were cut and how they were moved and certain things like that, but the only technological point that he makes is longitude. That's not something you do have to have accurate timepieces to draw. You're not going to get you don't just get good at tracking longitude by sailing a lot. You have to have two accurate timepieces in order to get good longitude. So that's
a difficulty, I would say. Yeah, I agree with that.
But at the same time, as he points out, there's a lot of things about he does definitely look at it from a Stone Age perspective. And when I look at those things, like the vases, for example, that they like to talk about with the real fancy, real precise vases and all those things, I'm sure you're aware. Ben Van Kirkwick likes to talk about them and stuff. For millions of years, hominids, like stone was the only real tool. There was wood and stone, and if you were good with stuff, you were good with stone. And for literally millions of years, hominids were passing down the skills of how to carve stone, how to shape stone tools from one to the other. And then humans did this for 10,000, 100,000, however long, and then we get to the age of metal, and those skills would taper off pretty quickly. We disappear from the record even. I mean, like horsemanship skills are a lot less now than they were 200 years ago. An example I frequently use is when the Americans in Vietnam, they'd closed down all their sniper schools after World War II. And when they reopened sniper schools during the Vietnam War, they had to use American Olympic marksmen to train their snipers because they didn't have any of the soldiery knowledge was gone. And it just takes 20 years for that. So something like the knowledge of how these things were done and stuff, some of the stuff is enigmatic, but I don't think it takes high technology. And I don't really think Graham is going out onto that high technology limb either. I think it's more of there is something up here that we don't quite understand. And, that makes sense. There's a lot of ancient technologies that we wouldn't understand today if we saw them put to bear, that little things like that we don't do anymore. We haven't done for thousands of years. So it doesn't even make sense to us. Like, I don't think that there was ancient high technology, but I do think that a guy who's a fifth generation sculptor, for example, today is going to know way more about that than any 10 of us sitting around speculating from our armchairs would. And so I think that tradition would go way back to where things like those vases, I don't think there was high technology involved. I think if we saw them do it, we would just be like, that's pretty freaking interesting, but I never would have thought about that in a million years. Kind of like if you watch people play baseball and they give strategy, and it's usually common sense when you hear them say it, but you'd never thought of it if you didn't play baseball a lot. So is that kind of, I think, just a gap in knowledge from our cultural disconnect is where a lot of this like awe comes from. Is something that was simple to them is crazily hard to us.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose going back to this idea of pre-Younger Dryas civilization, there are some limitations on what it could have been like. So, I mean, the evidence doesn't support a sort of globe-spanning culture, because then you'd see its DNA and the DNA of various products,
Yep.
fruit and vegetables, whatever, crop up in places where they're not supposed to be. Now, that itself, that evidence might be quite hard to interpret. But as my understanding is, we don't see that. But that doesn't mean there couldn't have been a more localized culture that was reasonably advanced in terms of astronomy, seafaring, and then after the impact decided, hey, let's go and see who's still around.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. There's, like you said, there's a lot. It's in a spot where it's pretty much impossible to prove or disprove. It is very much into the realm of speculation, but it is. It's interesting how that aspect of it right there, the part that we talked about here with the ancient high technology and lost civilizations and whatnot, because that gets stapled onto a comet smacking in northern ice sheets or an airburst. All of a sudden, all of this very provable, this very provable phenomena. If this happened, we can prove this, and that's just getting. We don't even need to look into any of this because it's just coming along with those guys talking about Atlantis and Anunnaki. And it's like, wow.
Yeah, I think there are worldwide myths and traditions that talk about some kind of apocalypse, if you want to call it that, back in history, something to do with the origins of civilization. There are many of them. So, I mean, is that all coincidence? I mean, it's not a good scientific argument, but it does set the scene that, okay, maybe there was something there. Let's look at that. And then the scientific evidence comes along. So this is the geochemical evidence in the Younger Dryas boundary layer. And it's so strong, so convincing, and there's so much of it. And the arguments against it are so bad. If you read the comprehensive refutation paper, full of very bad science. So the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is still a very strong position, I think.
Yeah, that's one of the things that's very telling to me is that the arguments against it are continuously basically ad hominems. They all come back to it attacking the credibility of the Comet Research Group and Alan West. That's basically the shtick.
Well, that seems to be the way when someone doesn't have a decent scientific argument, then they're desperate, and so it seems to be the way. Okay, we'll try and take the person out instead of tackling the evidence and the arguments. It's quite a common thing. It's not science.
When I did the recent video on the missing data set from the Greenland paper, the Kurbatov et al. Nanodiamonds in the Greenland ice core paper, the one that Mark Boslow always likes to say that there's a missing data set. They didn't. It's not archived at the National Snow and Ice Data Center like the paper says it is. Therefore, there's a big problem there, and these guys are just falsifying data. And it took some scratching the surface and digging into it, but it's like at the end of the day, that's the National Snow and Ice Data Center is just an archive. So the Comet Research Group, they could have just sent them whatever effing data that they wanted to, and the National Snow and Ice Data Center would have put it in their archive. So if they were faking data, why would they not send it to them? They would just send them whatever the hell they wanted to fake. It's really all they don't send them ice cores. They send them numbers. That's the thing that Boslow made sure to obfuscate to make it sound like the National Snow and Ice Data Center is supposed to have this magic piece of ice with nanodiamonds. And it's like, buddy, that got burned up in the lab and you fucking know it. So that's where it's like that underhanded crap. And then where I mean, it takes people from the outside to come in and parse through all this bullshit because they gish gallop it. They know that they're dealing mostly with people that are not they're maybe scientifically literate, but are not literate in the field. So they just have to dig and dig and dig and dig and dig.
Well, a lot
It's
of the problems with the
gross.
comprehensive refutation paper are basically to do with data, the way the data is handled, their data analysis. A lot of the problems are interpretation as well, but a lot of it, the sort of some of the sort of big issues that they rely on to support their case are to do with how they've mishandled data. And so, we had to spend quite a bit of time in pushing back in our rebuttals, actually showing that they've mishandled the data, so their data analysis is poor. So actually what I'm saying is that any scientist should be able to see that their case is full of holes, because it's mainly about how they've handled the data and how badly they've handled the data.
Wow. Yeah, from as a non-scientist, like I say, I look for other clues usually, and one of the dead giveaways for me on that paper was half the names are archaeologists and anthropologists, which I mean, if you want me to weigh in on whether or not a comet hit the Earth, I could help you as much as they could, but we're all well outside of our wheelhouse talking about that. So I don't understand where their names even belong on the paper. But it was all Red Rover, Red Rover. Make sure I get on that one too, buddy. Let everybody know that I'm against the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. Put my name on it. That paper kind of was one of the more ideologically driven ones, and it wore it on its sleeve. It was pretty plain what it was trying to do there.
Yeah, and it has a similar flavor to it as to the accusations that are sort of thrown around at Graham Hancock. It all feels like it's coming from the same place.
It is coming from the same place, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean the refutation paper was sort of clothed in sort of scientific language, but really it's using some of the same techniques that have been aimed at people like Graham to try and make its case. In other words, ad hominems.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's John Hoops. He's a big part of the push against Graham Hancock, right? Has been forever and a day. And he is, I saw it firsthand on Twitter. Who was it? It was Forbes magazine posted a link to a Younger Dryas impact hypothesis thing. And there was a very short article that they had, but it was not critical. There was no critical information. It didn't reference the computation. That was the big one. It didn't reference the comprehensive refutation. And so Hoops is like freaking out and yelling about it and saying, why don't they check Wikipedia? I don't understand why they don't look at Wikipedia. And it's like, Hoops edits the Wikipedia page for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It's, how the hell is that not like how is that part of the scientific ethics? How is that not getting censored? That's just to be, if me and you are having a debate about what year the iPhone came out, and I say, go check Wikipedia, and I'm the guy that edits the iPhone Wikipedia page, that's not very honest now, is it?
Yeah, the Wikipedia page for the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis and other pages bears no relation at all to the science. It's manufactured in a similar way to the comprehensive refutation paper. It's similar people, maybe some of the same people, who knows, who have got some kind of dogma to push.
It's a weird one to me, honestly, that I have a hard time understanding how people can get that worked up about. I usually just use it to the term big rocks, but it's like, how do people get that upset about how big rocks were stacked? I just don't get it. But that ends up being the root cause of why they have a problem with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. There's no problem with the KT impact. Alvarez faced skepticism, but he faced nothing like what you guys are facing with this. He faced skepticism. You guys are facing cynicism. A big difference.
Jim Powell did a really good job with his pseudo skeptic paper, so that was really nice, and he's absolutely spot on. That he lists sort of signals of pseudo skeptic sort of arguments that you would expect to see of a pseudo skeptic. So he lists them, and then he goes on to show that actually these are all characteristics of YDIH opponents, the things that they have said. So it's a nice paper.
Yeah, it's a great paper. I covered it not too a few months back on my channel. It was it's the the younger dryas impact hypothesis is something that I'm not 100% sold on. I'm not opposed to the idea. It's the science. To be honest, from a guy on the outside, the polarization get really difficult to parse. Right? I mean, you don't have these researchers being honestly critiqued from the outside. You have these researchers being shit on from the outside. So it becomes two teams battling, and at a point like that, that's whatever you have to start scratching the hood. You have to look under the hood on every single claim, right? It's you can't trust the actors anymore. I mentioned to a friend of mine that usually I can trust the hard data with the YDIH, not from the Comet Research Group. I mean, just in general, you can't trust what's going on as much as you could with a normal scientific discourse because of where it's at.
Yeah, so there's nothing like this. Have I ever seen before? So my own field, it's mainly very, very temperate, very placid. If there's any kind of discussion, it's generally well refereed. But this younger dryas impact hypothesis debate is just incredible. I've never seen anything like it. It's beyond. It's not science. This is not how most of science works. Now there are. I mean, you do hear about, well, there are other cases like this in other fields, but I haven't met them. This is my first exposure to one of these crazy sort of battles between
Yeah,
two opposing sides. It's amazing.
it is. It's really amazing to look at it from the outside, to see. Like Mark Young said that he wasn't allowed to edit the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis Wikipedia page because it would be considered a conflict of interest. It's like, well, what do you want me to edit it? I mean, who the fuck's supposed to edit the thing? But the guys that are working, it's so clearly it's become so clearly ideologically bent, and that's one of the things. When I started doing YouTube videos, I was really naively thinking, if I talk about big rocks and pyramids, I won't have to touch politics ever. Nobody will ever. It's everything. They just want to staple that sidecar onto every dang discussion you have nowadays, and it's gotten ridiculous. Where that should have nothing to do with whether or not a comet struck the northern ice sheets 12,000 years ago. It should not matter one iota what the implications of that are to Graham Hancock or to Mark Fagato or whoever. That should not matter. It should just, what's the data and what do we get out of it? But that's not where this, and the politicians, if anybody's out there saying we need to make sure that the public doesn't get the right answer, that should be politicians. That's their job, is to be like, we need to withhold evidence from the public. The scientists, they're supposed to be out there screaming, hey, get this information out there. But instead, like I say all the time, these guys are a bunch of, they're just ideologues in lab coats. They use their credentials to basically prop up their bullshit as though it was actually credentialed science.
Yeah, and that's how this comprehensive refutation paper reads as well. It's much of the same kind of arguments in that you've seen leveled against Graham Hancock.
Yeah. It was basically, even though the paper's aimed at you and the Comet Research Group, those things are pretty much, it's all aimed at Hancock in a lot of ways. Sadly, he's the big figurehead of the group. So even when they start talking about like their unsavory political talking points, they don't reference the people that actually go down those roads. They're going to point at Hancock and blame him for all of it, because that's, a lot of it, I mean, I hate to say it, but as a guy who can look at the stuff from a YouTube perspective, a lot of it's just about getting clicks. If you go out and make, like, archaeoastronomy is less popular, for example, than ancient high technology, right? But to me, it's far more interesting. So I still like to talk about it, although I know that my archaeoastronomy videos don't get as many clicks as my ones that are talking about a pyramid, for example. But to the guys that are combating pseudoscience, there's really only one target that gets clicks, and that guy's name is Graham Hancock. The rest of these guys, they're all just, they're hangers on as far as they're concerned. So it's a sad situation for him. And it's also really sad for anybody whose evidence or any work that gets seen or cited or anything by him, because all of a sudden it becomes part of that whole, this is absolutely bullshit. Must be Graham liked it.
Exactly. That's exactly. I think that's what's going on.
It's really sad too. Well, I think, go ahead and get close to wrapping it up. If unless you had something more that you wanted to lay out, Martin, and if you do, please do so, because I do have a few more minutes, but I would like to,
No, that's really nice. Thanks very much, Dan. It's been a really interesting conversation, and yeah, thanks for listening to me and giving me the time.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it. You brought a lot of this information to bear, and having it just kind of spilled out for my audience instead of me saying it, that helps a lot. A lot of these things, they get the GED layman perspective from, and it's better to get the info from the horse's mouth. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me here.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Thank you.